Well, this is a prophecy update holiday bonus round to supplement a little bit of what I talked about yesterday. I talk a lot about the convergence of events, all of the things that seem to indicate that the return of the Lord is getting closer and closer. There are a lot of things that I haven't even talked about in recent weeks, such as things going on in the church that I think are very troubling and which are probably as indicative of where we are on God's timeline than anything else. But I want to address a few issues today. I'm going to look at some quick developments regarding Resolution 2334 that I talked a lot about yesterday. Then we're going to look at the situation in Europe, and then Syria and what is going on with the alignment of the nations in that regard, which I think is incredibly prophetically significant. Matthew 24, verse 6, "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places." With regard to Resolution 2334, there are a few updates. The Jerusalem Post today has 2 pages in its paper devoted to things going on with regard to the Israeli and world response with regard to Resolution 2334. There's also a front page article in the Jerusalem Post and a large article in the international section of the New York Times about how is Mr. Netanyahu going to respond to the adoption of Resolution 2334. The New York Times and other people on the left, including within the Israeli government structure or the leftist parties in Israel, think that Mr. Netanyahu will now have to make a choice as to whether he is going to go along with the international community or whether he's going to submit to the Jewish right. People believe that he'll submit to the Jewish right because he wants to keep the Jewish right in check and be able to maintain power without having to necessarily bring all the aspects of the Jewish right into his coalition government. One of the people on the Jewish right that is very pro-settlement is Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett has essentially come out and said the adoption of Resolution 2334 essentially means the end of Oslo and the end of the two-state solution, and now Israel can begin to apply Israeli law within all areas of Judea and Samaria, areas that are erroneously called the West Bank. Naftali Bennett says there's just no reason to continue the charade of not having Israel exercise law or exercise authority over all those areas. Now, there's a lot of people think that Israel has not annexed those areas directly since the 1967 war because they're afraid that by doing so, the number of Arabs within Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, would then create a demographic or a population problem for Israel that the Arabs would outpopulate the Jews. I don't think that that's true. The Arab birth rates have been collapsing in the areas of Judea and Samaria. Caroline Glick covered that quite extensively in her book, The Israeli Solution, going through the sort of made-up statistics that have caused a lot of people within Israel and the United States, and I think you even saw Samantha Power in her statement with regard to Resolution 2334 make reference to this, that if these areas were annexed, if it was just a one-state solution, Israel would lose its character as a Jewish state because the Arabs would have the majority population. There are many, Caroline Glick and others, that believe that that is a myth, and that myth is being used to keep the two-state solution viable. Naftali Bennett would reject that as well. The quote from the New York Times today is, "Mr. Bennett did not seem deterred." In a statement to reporters on Sunday at the Western Wall in the Old City in East Jerusalem, notice how they say this, the Old City in East Jerusalem. The New York Times and people on the left have already adopted what the Resolution 2334 did, which said East Jerusalem, the Old City, including the Jewish Quarter, the Wailing Wall, the Temple Mount, the Old City of David, all of those areas are really to be Palestinian areas. They've already adopted that as sort of like this is going to be the conclusion. Mr. Bennett said, it's time to decide between two alternatives, surrendering our land or sovereignty. He added that steps would be taken in the near future to try to apply Israeli law in Judea and Samaria, the biblical terms for the West Bank. Well, at least they got that part right. It's also interesting that one of the things that Mr. Netanyahu has called all of the ambassadors to appear, including the U.S. ambassador, Dan Shapiro. Mr. Shapiro has also made a request to the Israeli government. He's not going to be, after January 20th, he will not be the U.S. ambassador to Israel, but he wants to remain in Israel so that his daughter can finish school, just like Obama wants to remain in Washington so his daughters can finish school. Now, I think part of it, and I think Caroline Glick suggested this in a Facebook post today, that Obama wants to stay in Washington and Shapiro wants to stay in Jerusalem so they can cause trouble and keep tabs on things. And I am willing to be convinced that that's not the case, but you're going to have to bring forward pretty strong evidence that that's not the case. The Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, that is an organization of which Dor Gold, former ambassador to the U.S., is the president, has a number of very good analytical articles. It's one of those sites that I would recommend that you check with some regularity to get, I think, a better perspective on things than you will get from mainstream media sources. Sites that I regularly check would include GatesstoneInstitute.org, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, which deals with Israeli security, regional diplomacy, and international law. Very good analyses that you will find there, papers that are written from time to time, and videos. You'll see a couple of those today just to give you a flavor. An American think tank that I look at a lot is the Center for Security Policy, headed up by Frank Gaffney. He has a daily podcast called Secure Freedom Radio. If you just go and Google Secure Freedom Radio, you can find that. And he usually has a 4-segment show, brings in experts on security and foreign policy, usually 4 different ones each day, although sometimes he'll do sort of a deep dive with just one guest. And I highly recommend it as just to get a flavor for what's going on. He has great analysts come on, such as Diana West and Claire Lopez. And I think these are people that, and Claudia Rosette, people that I think have a lot to say. I think their analysis is pretty good and solid. Those would be 3 of the major ones that I check. I also check other center and center-left and left institutes, like I do check the Council on Foreign Relations. I check the Brookings Institute. But you have to filter all of these through the perspective that they're going to bring to a particular problem. But in any event, with regard to Resolution 2334, there's a good article by former Ambassador Alan Baker and also some related video called The Dangers of UN Security Council Resolution 2334. I'm just going to read a few quotes from this article. You can look it up at the JCPA website if you'd like. There are things that he is concerned about Resolution 2334 and the way that it's worded. He doesn't think that it's necessarily enforceable, but it certainly gives a reference point for how things are going to go in the future. It's not legally binding. It doesn't create any necessary legal rights, but it certainly is an indication of how the international community is going to look at things, including, at least for another 20-some days, the United States government. So here are some of Mr. Baker's concerns about the Resolution 2334. First of all, references in the 10th preambular paragraph, and you can go to any number of websites and find, just type in Resolution 2334 and you can find it. Reference in the 10th preambular paragraph, that's the introductory paragraphs, to the fact that, quote, the status quo is not sustainable, quote, and, quote, entrenching a one-state reality, unquote, are new. They're new phraseology used in resolutions of this type, and they would appear to be inspired by or even direct quotes from statements by President Obama, Secretary of State Kerry, and Vice President Biden. And I think he's right. I think he's being very insightful here that the current U.S. administration was working behind the scenes to get in place a parting shot at Israel and Netanyahu that would make things difficult for the incoming Trump administration. So you can, and I know that most of you that listen to this would not be swayed by Mr. Obama's sort of this false bravado that he's put out that, oh, I'm just trying to help cooperate in the transition to the new administration. He's putting on that facade, but it's, as with most things with Mr. Obama, it's totally fake, and he has an agenda behind it, and he's going to further his agenda because he doesn't care really what happened in the election. Another concern, Mr. Baker also notes that much of the terminology repeats UN terminology and language used in previous Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, such as Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, secure and recognized borders, violation under international law, etc. But there have been a couple of significant changes from prior phrases used in resolutions of these types. I just gave you two of them. The status quo is not sustainable, and we are entrenching a one-state solution. This is, again, I believe, showing the Obama administration working in the background to put in place what they want to have happen. There's a phrase in there in Resolution 2334 that says, quote, expressing grave concern that continuing Israeli settlement activities are dangerously imperiling the viability of the two-state solution based on the 1967 lines. Ambassador Baker, Mr. Baker says this. Similarly, expressions not previously included in major Security Council resolutions regarding the peace process, such as, quote, a two-state solution based on the 1967 lines, unquote, as well as the references to, quote, the Arab Peace Initiative, unquote, and, quote, the principle of land for peace, comma, as additional bases for peace, clearly are intended to instill concepts that have never been agreed upon elements in the negotiating process. The framework for negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians has, since 1993, been language within the Oslo Peace Accord that a lot of these things are reserved for final status talks and negotiations. This resolution undermines that concept. I think this is a very insightful article. He also says this, Mr. Baker. The reference in the third operative paragraph to the 4 June 1967 lines as a basis for negotiations would appear to be a new element, echoing statements by Obama and Kerry and running counter to 1967 Security Council Resolution 242. And I think that's also right. He then summarizes his objections. He clearly says that this is an attempt. These are attempts to modify Resolution 242 and get away from some of the language there and essentially force something on the Jewish state of Israel. There's also his conclusion, the United States, he says, by not vetoing the resolution, which includes language stating, quote, Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and I just referenced that earlier, unquote, indicates U.S. acceptance of the fact that the territories and East Jerusalem belong to the Palestinians. Now, this is going to change when Mr. Trump takes office on January 20th. But what Obama is doing, and one of the articles in the Jerusalem Post said that there was tremendous fear within the government of Israel and Mr. Netanyahu as to what Obama's going to do in the next 20-some days in this regard. There is some fear that Mr. Kerry will make a very definitive speech on the Middle East. We'll have to wait and see if that happens. Well, I want to now talk a little bit, or a lot, about just what's going on with the alignment of nations in the world and things going on in the world. And what appears to be the fact that the United States government, at least the Obama administration, does not understand the nature of the threat that we face. For example, here is a Breitbart report just yesterday. Harvard University launches fellowships in Islamic law to influence U.S. policy. And you will see a push from these academic institutions, funded in large part by the Saudis and others in the Sunni Arab world, to change the narrative, to shape the understanding of Sharia law. Remember what people like Phil Haney have said. Sharia law is the ultimate goal, the imposition of Sharia law. Tactics such as immigration, jihad, and terror are tactics that are employed to achieve the imposition of Sharia law. You need to remember that. Funding these fellowships in Islamic law at Harvard is an attempt to change that reality, to change the perception of that. And know that at Georgetown University there is a well-funded Saudi government, or Saudi Arab or Sunni Arab, funded by Saudis to shape what America thinks about Sharia law and Islam. It's being done. So you need to be aware of that. The problem with this is that it's just, in a year where we've seen the deadliest year for migrants crossing the Mediterranean, Europe, in many respects, seems undeterred in stopping this influx. It is going to collapse, if it has not already collapsed, European governments. There's a populist revolt in place in Europe in response to this, but the immigration still continues to happen. I mentioned a couple weeks ago what World War III might look like, a good paper by George Friedman at Geopolitical Futures. Listen to what he says as to how things might be playing out in Europe at the time of the beginning of World War III. And I think you can see this already happening during this time. And he was talking about some conflicts going on between the U.S. and China. During this time, Europe will be destabilizing. NATO will be weakened now that the U.S. is engaged in Asia and diverting forces there. The EU will have been fragmenting for a long time. Nationalist political parties will be taking power, and their goal will be to protect the interests of their own nation, not Europe as a whole. There will be small conflicts in Europe. The disintegration of the EU and the weakness of NATO will allow conflicts within and between nations to operate unchecked. Germany, the major power in Europe, will have its own economic and social problems, and given its history, will not be allowed to play the role of occupier and peacemaker. There is a massive demographic problem with an aging population in Europe. People reach a certain age, they no longer work. They need people to support them. Europe has allowed massive Muslim immigration from the Middle East and Africa to come in, to have workers who will pay the pensions and health care benefits that older retired workers need, because there aren't enough ethnic, say, German young people coming up to work that can pay the benefits that have been promised to the older people. Rather than cutting benefits, Europe calculated that it would be better to bring in Muslim immigrants. That will cause the collapse of their society ultimately, because they're bringing in people who don't share values. They have a different value system, and they will either take power or the countries will eventually degrade into civil war. If that happens in the context of some other people and other places of the world trying to exert power, Europe will be of no assistance. This week, Prince Charles is getting up there in years. I believe he's about 60, 68 or so. And his mother's now, I believe, the longest reigning monarch or second longest reigning monarch in the history of the United Kingdom, gave a Christmas speech that I think is sort of stunning in its ignorance. Here's just a clip from that.
And the suffering doesn't end when they arrive seeking refuge in a foreign land. We are now seeing the rise of many populist groups across the world that are increasingly aggressive towards those who adhere to a minority faith. All of this has deeply disturbing echoes of the dark days of the 1930s. I was born in 1948, just after the end of World War II, in which my parents' generation had fought and died in a battle against intolerance, monstrous extremism, and an inhuman attempt to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. That nearly 70 years later, we should still be seeing such evil persecution is, to me, beyond all belief. We owe it to those who suffered and died so horribly not to repeat the horrors of the past. Normally, at Christmas, we think of the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ. I wonder, though, if this year we might remember how the story of the Nativity unfolds, with the fleeing of the Holy Family to escape violent persecution. And we might also remember that when the Prophet Muhammad migrated from Mecca to Medina, he did so because he, too, was seeking the freedom for himself and his followers to worship. Whichever religious path we follow, the destination is the same: to value and respect the other person.
Equating Joseph and Mary fleeing from what Herod was going to try to accomplish in Bethlehem by slaying all the children, all the male children under the age of 2. Equating that with the migration of Muhammad is, I would say, royally stupid. And in response to what Prince Charles had to say, I would say, long live the Queen. At least, please, live a minute longer than this dweeb and save the world from that. In Italy, a couple weeks ago, Foreign Policy had this article, "The Resignation of Renzi, the Fall of Rome." Populists in Italy have been propped up by the massive immigration that has taken place there. In fact, I'll talk a little bit about this in the terror attack in Germany this week, but that has an Italian component too that I think played into the fall of the Renzi government. This article: the demands from the gathering forces of European populism range from erecting border fences to dismantling the euro. Some insurgent parties want greater physical leeway from Europe. Others want their money back from neighboring nations. They share one thing: their ideas would unravel the 60-year project of European integration. A couple of weeks ago, even after some of these attacks had occurred, Angela Merkel was sticking with her vow to integrate migrants into German society. Terror may become the new normal in Europe. We had this terrorist attack in Berlin the other day. Front page news. Some very interesting, couple of interesting articles on the front of the New York Times. A terrorist, turned out to be from Tunisia, hijacked a truck, a semi-truck, and drove it into a crowd at a Christmas market in Berlin, killing at least a dozen people. At the same time, there was an assassination in Ankara of the Russian ambassador to Turkey. I'll talk more about that in just a moment because I think that has some significance. Merkel's response to that was that, well, we may have to rethink things. There was tremendous backlash against her. They eventually found the fingerprints of this Tunisian immigrant. He had spent 3 or 4 years in prison in Italy for having burned down a school. He was chased across a large part of Europe. He was supposedly allowed to stay in the country because, well, for one, Tunisia was approached about him, and they didn't want him back because he was a terrorist, they thought. So Europe was stuck. I mean, Europe had allowed him to immigrate, and you can only undo that if you can send the person someplace else. So he essentially fell through the cracks, and now, because of the inaction of the German government, at the behest of the policies of Angela Merkel, 12 people are dead. He eventually made it back to Milan, Italy, where he was killed in a gun battle with police. That's a picture of the burning school that this person had done a number of years ago that led to him being put in prison in Italy. He got out of prison, got multiple identities, and he was able to very cleverly game the system. And now 12 people are dead. And I believe the blood of those people belongs on the hands of Angela Merkel. And how he was able to, there's a good map in the Daily Mail from the other day sort of tracing his history as he migrated first to Sicily, then to Italy, and eventually served time in prison, then went to Germany, and then was able to get, after there was this massive manhunt for who had done the truck attack in Berlin, they were looking for him, and he was still able to get 600 miles across Europe because he knew what to do. And now Angela Merkel has said that she will consider a migrant policy change. I think this will eventually, it should collapse her government. It should lead to her being voted out of office at the next election. It is stunning that she is able to have remained in office. Europe is filled with no-go zones because of Islamic Muslim migration. In France, in Sweden, in Germany, there are places that the police simply will not go because it is not safe for them. Those areas effectively already have Sharia law enacted. You need to just read the Gatestone Institute, which covers this in some detail weekly. There are articles about what is going on in Europe, and you should read those. Now, I want to turn to the Middle East and just a little bit about this campaign to retake Mosul. This campaign started a number of months ago with great optimism that they were going to drive out ISIS. They only had 3,000 or 4,000 fighters left in Mosul, and we should be able to make pretty quick work of them. The battle to retake Mosul is frankly not going that well. It's stalemated. This is a good article in Foreign Policy. There's also another good website to check if you want to find out about how these conflicts are going, particularly in Syria and Iraq, is a website called understandingwar.org, the Institute for the Study of War's website, understandingwar.org. So here is Mosul, and you can see within Mosul, the battle was raging in the outskirts of Mosul. They have not made much progress towards the center of Mosul, a very large city. And you can see here, this area right here in the center is the Nineveh ruins, the ruins of the ancient city of Nineveh. And I think it would behoove us to maybe look at what the Bible says about Nineveh. I don't have time to do that this week. Maybe we'll do that in the future if somebody reminds me. But listen to what the foreign policy article says, analysis says about Mosul. Arabic media, however, and this is in response to the opening paragraphs that say, coming out from United States and other people involved, the Iraqi government, that everything's going great in Mosul. It's not. Arabic media, however, reported that Iraqi forces were still shelling Sumer, that's part of Mosul, after Isler had declared it secure. While maps made by media activists that coordinate with government security forces still list the neighborhood as under Islamic State control. So while Iraqi and U.S. statements say we've taken control of this area, people on the ground are saying, no, you haven't. The Counterterrorism Service Foreign Policy says, which is bearing the brunt of the operation, and this is a very important fact that needs to be understood. The Counterterrorism Service, which is bearing the brunt of the operation, is facing a degree of attrition that risks the successful completion of anti-ISIS operations in Mosul. Senior U.S. military officials reported that the U.S.-trained Golden Brigade, the first of the 3 brigades of the Counterterrorism Service, is facing a 50% casualty rate and could be rendered combat ineffective in a month if the rate remains constant. 50% casualty rate and could be rendered combat ineffective in a month if the rate remains constant. A 50% casualty rate has a tremendous, as you can appreciate, a tremendous negative effect on the attitude of the troops that remain. This is because of the tactics that are being employed by Mosul. And I think you need to watch the tactics that are being employed in Mosul by the Islamic State and understand that these same tactics are going to be used in the event that Israel has to invade Lebanon to take care of the problem there and the Hamas and Hezbollah missiles that are positioned there. There are tunnels being built in Lebanon, and this is going to be in the event that Israel has to go back in there to take care of that problem. And I think to totally eradicate it, they will probably have to go into Lebanon to do that. They will be facing the same things that the Counterterrorism Service is facing here. And these are U.S.-trained troops. Supposedly they've gotten good training, but it's because of the tactics of the Islamic State that they're facing a 50% casualty rate. This is stunning. It continues. The CTS has deliberately slowed operations in eastern Mosul in order to reduce the rate of attrition, and the Iraqi security force announced it will begin to rely more on artillery and precision airstrikes to target ISIS militants in response. They've already been using these military airstrikes to attack militants, but the problem is that ISIS has embedded itself within a large population center, and they're using these people as human shields. As foreign policy says, these new tactics, however, will likely increase civilian casualties because ISIS militants continue to use Mosul's civilian population as human shields. This is exactly the same tactic that Hezbollah is using in southern Lebanon. It is setting up these missile launchers next to schools, homes, churches, mosques. It's the same thing they do in Gaza. And this is a tactic that people need to know that the Israeli Defense Force is going to have to deal with this. And I'm sure they're as capable as anybody else, but it is still it causes a high casualty impact in forces that even well-trained forces have problems dealing with this tactic. It says this: the Iraqi security forces will either be forced to heavily deploy its assets from other areas of the country to match the capability of the elite CTS forces, or to call upon non-acceptable partners such as the Popular Mobilization to complete the current operation in Mosul. So anybody who thinks that it's going to be an easy task to go into Mosul, to go into Raqqa, or other areas under the control of the Islamic State is very naive. This is a massive problem, and it probably indicates why there has not been a massive push really by anyone to go in and attack these people other than in sort of superficial airstrikes and artillery shelling. That's not going to win the war against the Islamic State. The United States doesn't go in, Russia doesn't go in, the Syrian regime doesn't go in. Right now, everybody seems to be content to allow them to sort of remain in control of this desert area of what used to be Syria and Iraq. But it's something to bear watching. Now I want to talk about Syria. I'm a little reluctant to do this because I know I will get all kinds of hate mail from the Russian supporters out there that Russia and Syria are the knights in shining armor and there's nothing wrong with them. Now that's maybe a little bit overstated, so let me just make some qualifying statements as to what I'm going to talk about. I am far more concerned about how this lines up. I'm far more interested in seeing how this lines up with Bible prophecy than I am necessarily determining who is right or who is wrong on the ground in what the country that we used to call Syria, that we still pretend exists as a country called Syria, but it doesn't exist as a country called Syria. What we see from this airstrike map from the Institute for the Study of War, understandingwar.org, is that Russian airstrikes are, over the past month, have been low confidence. We haven't really been able to determine whether they actually occurred. But to the extent that they did occur, they are not really attacking the Islamic State. They are attacking Syrian rebels that come from any number of different groups, Al-Qaeda-related groups, Free Syrian Army, and those other organizations. There are certainly appears to be over a dozen such groups, loosely aligned in opposition to the Syrian regime. Now, I understand that Russia has interests that they're trying to further in Syria. I get that. But when Russia came into Syria back in March or May of 2015, about a year and a half ago, they said they were coming in to fight ISIS. They haven't really done anything to fight ISIS. So it's clear that they're doing something to further their interest in Syria. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment, because what's happened in Syria has been a complete demographic change in the composition of Syria. I have some things to show you that. So we know that over the past few weeks, Aleppo has fallen. There's been a lot of disinformation coming out from all sides in connection with the fall of Aleppo. There were accusations that the Syrian regime, the Syrian army, the regular Syrian army under the control of Bashar al-Assad, was slaughtering civilians in Aleppo. I have not found credible support for those stories. At the same time, we know that 500,000 Syrians at least have been killed in the Syrian civil war, which has now gone on for 5.5 years. It's not all the fault of the U.S., it's not all the fault of Russia, but there is something more going on about how, and it particularly becomes apparent, I think, when you look at the fall of Aleppo. There has been tremendous destruction in the rebel areas of Aleppo. Part of that has been to accomplish a demographic change in Syria. The accomplishment of that demographic change in Syria has prophetic implications because it has resulted in a strengthening alliance between Russia and Iran, and effectively the creation of a Shiite crescent that now extends almost all the way from Iran to the Mediterranean. that has, I believe, significant prophetic implications. I'm now going to play you a video, couple of videos. The first one is former Ambassador Dorgold, president of the Jerusalem Center. He was doing a panel discussion with Professor Alan Dershowitz in Israel at the Jerusalem Center, talking about things in the Middle East. He's going to do about a minute and a half clip on about a minute and a half clip on averting another Aleppo. But I want you to grasp some of the things that he's saying out there from a factual basis and how it relates to the alignment of these countries.
We have Aleppo. Mm-hmm. And I mention Aleppo because when I was ambassador to the UN in the late 1990s, the UN was going through a period of tremendous anguish because on the watch of the Secretaries General in the 90s, several events occurred. Of course, the genocide in Rwanda, the genocidal events that occurred in the war in Bosnia, including the Battle of Srebrenica. And this caused the elites of the international community to say we have to make sure these outbursts don't occur again. One of the reasons I recall that the Obama administration said America has to intervene in Libya because Gaddafi's forces were on their way to Benghazi. And they were convinced that Benghazi was about to become the Srebrenica of North Africa. Well, what is now occurring in Aleppo is worse than anything I've just mentioned. Yeah. Yeah. And it's not just the mass murder. It is moving the whole Sunni population out of parts of Syria and bringing in Shiite population from different parts of the Middle East. Yeah, you're right. So I think, the new incoming Secretary of State, one of the things that he will have to deal with, and the President will have to deal with, is restoring some basis of world order. And convincing the world that they're not going to allow Aleppo to occur again.
And so the important thing to remember there is that what's been done is Aleppo, particularly the Sunni areas of Aleppo, have been destroyed. Those Sunnis have had to leave the country. They have migrated to neighboring countries such as Turkey and Jordan, but also hundreds of thousands, over millions of them, have also immigrated to Europe. And so there has been this massive demographic shift within Syria to get rid of the Sunni Arab population. The Russians have participated in that in causing that demographic shift. It is part of their interest. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. And so, but what it's done is, as they get rid of the Sunnis, the Shiites come in to repopulate the area, and we have a further cementing of the relationship between Russia and Iran. Now, here's another video from a retired general at the Jerusalem Center talking a little bit about Aleppo. I'm not going to play the whole thing. You can go to the website and look at the whole video.
What is the importance of the attack on Aleppo?
By taking over Aleppo, the Syrian regime, well, actually it's not the Syrian regime, it's the Iran with Hezbollah and the Russian support, managed to carry out some sort of game changer in what seems to be a never-ending war in Syria.
What is the importance of Aleppo to Syria?
Well, Aleppo is the northernmost city in the ring of cities that make the heart of Syria, which is from Aleppo in the north through Homs and Hama up to Damascus in the south, of course with Tartus and Latakia along the coast. This is the heart of Syria. The importance of these events in Aleppo is that the Assad forces, with all those who back them, are able to prove to themselves that they can decide a battle. This is something that they haven't done for a long time. This, of course, will empower them and embolden them in their efforts to take back other parts of Syria, probably first of all the area of Idlib. In this respect, as I said, this is a game changer in the war. That said, it's still not over. It's far from being over, but I think that we have to put it also in context. It's happening in the time when the American administration is lacking from the game. And what we're seeing now is an effort by the Iranians and the Russians to shape Syria before Trump administration comes in. So that when they start dealing with Trump on the bargain, the big Russian-American bargain that everybody is expecting, they will have a lot of leverage, and they will not be in a position where they have to ask for something in Syria, but they can offer something in Syria. And that's, in my mind, the main reason why they are making such a big effort now in Aleppo, unfortunately for the Americans and maybe fortunately for them, in a successful manner.
What caused this mess? And why has Aleppo been the center of hostilities for the past few years?
Aleppo has been the center of atrocities for the last couple of years because of its importance, and because it's a city that you have a variety of groups living there, but mainly Sunnis. And there was a feeling that those who will control Aleppo will be able to have an impact on the way the entire war, the civil war in Syria, develops. And that's why everybody was interested in having an impact on what's going on in Aleppo. We have to remember in this respect that Aleppo is also relatively close to the Turkish border, and all the logistics for the rebels were coming from the border, and that's why the rebels were able to hold their positions over there for such a long time. That was made this battle about Aleppo so critical for the war in Syria. Having said that, in the first year of the war, Aleppo was outside of the war, and the war was being fought mainly in rural areas and in the area of Idlib and in the area of Dara in the south. So the fall of Aleppo by itself doesn't mean immediately that this is the end of the war. There's still some war to be fought. There are vast areas of Syria who are not controlled by the government. We saw ISIS taking over Palmyra while this battle in Aleppo was being waged. So it's still too early to say that this is the end of the war, but it's definitely a sign that an end may take place soon.
Who are the combatants on each side?
Oh, of course, the combatants from the Syrian regime side is not necessarily the Syrian regime. Most of the forces there are supporters that were brought by Iran, especially Hezbollah, a considerable force of Hezbollah, and some other groups of Shiites and Iranians that were arranged by the Iranians to fight there, with the support of the Russians. On the other side, what we have is a mixture of many small factions of the Syrian rebels. Some of them are more extreme, like Al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria. Some of them are a little bit less extreme, groups that are affiliated with Muslim Brotherhood, groups that are affiliated with Saudi Arabia and Qatar. That's a mess of groups that operate there. They used to have some sort of joint operation room that coordinated between those groups, but it wasn't effective enough. And since the supporters of Assad were able to close most of the routes that lead to Aleppo from Turkey, the ability of the rebels to hold their positions came to the point where they had to give up on more and more land and more territory. And that's the story of Aleppo these days.
What happened this week?
Step by step, more and more neighborhoods of eastern Aleppo fell into the hands of the Assad regime. And what we see, it's really terrible massacres of innocent people. This has characterized the activity of the regime and its supporters throughout the war. And you see it even more so in these last few days in Aleppo, those areas taken over by the regime.
How will this end?
How will it end? Nobody knows. But I think definitely this is a major success for the regime and a major setback for the opposition. So I guess the opposition will be now more ready to accept all kinds of arrangements that actually leave Assad in power and can be seen as a success for Assad. It's still not over, but the direction right now seems to be quite clear.
Looking at the larger picture, who are the winners and losers in the Battle of Aleppo?
Regionally, this means major success for Iran in their effort to become the hegemon power in the Middle East. And this is, of course, coming on the expense of Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And it is a major success for Russia. That once again shows that it is a reliable friend for its allies, and it managed to help Assad overcome, when they entered more than a year ago, the situation of Assad seemed to be desperate. Today, thanks to their intervention, Assad's situation seems much better. And they are going to cash in their successes when the new administration comes in. And until then, they are going to even try to gain more ground and more assets so that they will be able to become a more powerful player in the Middle East and beyond it.
And so I think that analysis is pretty much spot on and correct. Russia has gained tremendously by this. They have air bases now in Syria. They have a warm water port along the Mediterranean, and they can use that to project power throughout the Middle East at the expense of the United States. So we'll have to see how this all plays out. But the important thing to take away from that is the cementing of the relationship and alliance between Russia and Iran. Now, Russia and Iran have historically been at odds with each other, and Russia is using Iran as sort of they're using their bases in port in Syria as a basis to kind of keep Iran in check, because Iran is a rising power. They have a lot of money. I think they're back developing their nuclear weapons. They'll violate that agreement, and they will But Ezekiel chapter 38 tells us about this northern alliance of nations from the north, or a nation from the north, and Persia. And the only thing that I can see happening in Aleppo this week is that alliance has gotten even stronger. That's the prophetic takeaway. I'm not judging whether Russia has the white hats or these I'm not making a value judgment. I'm only stating the fact that Russia and Iran are now in closer alliance than they have been. And that's going to continue to grow. As this retired general says, it's going to continue. They're going to try to cement that even further over the next few weeks before the Trump administration takes office. So that's one of the first takeaways from what happened in Aleppo over the past 2 weeks. Another country that's in Ezekiel chapter 38 is Turkey. And we had this interesting incident in Turkey this week of the assassination of this Russian ambassador by this Turkish police officer. And you can see him, he's raising his finger there. That is an ISIS salute. And he's claiming vengeance on behalf of Sunni Arab Muslims for what has happened in Aleppo. The Russian ambassador is dead. He was assassinated in the capital of Turkey. Some people think that this should cause some kind of rupture in the Turkish-Russian alliance. That hasn't happened. In some respects, they're closer together. So the body was returned to Russia for burial, given a state funeral. There's also this news yesterday that a Russian supply plane on its way to Syria crashed into the Black Sea, and 92 people were killed. We see in the latter days this alignment of nations, of what Ezekiel 38 says, Russia in alliance with Persia and Turkey. Now, the Turkey thing is very interesting. I've talked about it in the past. There's a lot of questions as to whether this coup that took place back in July was a staged coup by Erdogan to cement power. I don't personally believe that. I know other people make the argument that it was. The reason that I don't believe that is Turkey is in many respects a tribal society, as are most Muslim and Arab societies. Turkey, of course, is not Arab. but they still have that tribal culture. As a result of that, Erdogan has to be very clever in the way he manages all of those various different tribes. It's the same thing that the Assads have had to do in Syria during their period of power, which now extends out over 40 years. There are many different competing factions, ethnic, religious groups, and that type of thing that have to be played off against each other. The Assads, the father more so than the son that's now in control, have been very clever in doing that. Erdogan, I think, has learned how they've controlled that, all of those elements of society. However, when this coup took place, or attempted coup took place in Turkey back in July, Erdogan has followed that up with massive purges of people in the media, the military, education, business, and government. Reports are 100,000 people have been purged, maybe 50,000 of them have been imprisoned. Point of that is that I think it would be very dangerous for Erdogan to have done that coup when, and like any dictator, he has a list, an enemies list, and it's probably notebooks full of pages of people that he has to get rid of. He took the failed coup as an opportunity to purge people, but when he purged people, he effectively gutted the leadership in government, education, the military, and whatever. That, in some respects, made him more in control but weaker. Because he was weaker, he then had to look for alliance elsewhere to help shore him up, his power up. He found a willing partner for that in Russia. Russia saw in that an opportunity to move into the Middle East and to further cement its already, the fact that it already entered into the Middle East, into Syria, and now had an opportunity to control Turkey. And there's been So what we've seen this historical animus between Russia and Persia is going away. At the same time, the historical animus between Turkey and Russia is going away, with the result that there is this alignment. Now, Turkey was discussed to some in Friedman's sort of wargaming, what might happen and how World War III came about. He's talking about, there's conflict in Asia between the U.S. and China. They're focused on that. Europe is disintegrating. Why are they disintegrating? They're disintegrating because of massive Muslim immigration into Europe. The rise of populist parties that are more concerned about the nation rather than the big European Union. Russia has been very clever in the way they have used the opportunity in Syria to not only shore up their position in the Middle East, but to also weaken Europe at the same time. Look at what Friedman says when he talks about Turkey's chance. And Friedman is a big fan of Turkey and its importance. It does have, I believe, the 17th largest economy in the world. It has the largest army in Europe, and being sort of a stepchild, I guess, of the European Union. Turkey's chance, he says this, as all this is happening, Turkey, the leading Islamic country, would be alarmed and intrigued. If the Russians were to win the war, Turkey's position would be weakened and it might be forced to submit to Russia. Now, it's already been forced in some respects to do that by this coup and the purge that followed. But with Russia absorbed in Europe and the U.S. fighting a global war on two fronts, Turkey would see intriguing possibilities, could exert its influence in the Arab world, controlling its oil, or it could gain a foothold in Europe and the Balkans. It could also turn the Mediterranean into a Turkish lake. Turkey, at the same time, is going to be exerting its influence. But right now, from my perspective, Turkey needs the assistance of Russia. Erdogan needs the assistance of Russia to remain in power. There's also the situation, I think, I'll talk about it in a minute, the Kurds. So the result of this thing that happened this week, this assassination that took place in Ankara, is that Erdogan has grabbed more power. Russia I think, likes the fact that Turkey is involved somewhat in northern Syria, also fighting the Kurds, because those conflicts, I think, help Russia keep Turkey in check. They keep Iran in check, and Russia can take some benefit from that. But it's a very, very complicated situation. And I want you to remember the phrase in Ezekiel chapter 38 that talks about that there will be a hook put in the jaw of this northern power to draw them in. And I think we're seeing the beginnings of what I have long felt would be one of those, at least part of that hook. Erdogan's also talked about joining the Shanghai Bloc, which is Russia, China, and Turkey, of sort of a soft alliance of military and strategic power. Turkey has threatened Europe, saying that if we don't get what we want, you guys don't let us into Europe, we're going to let more immigrants cross Turkey into Europe and further bring about the collapse of Europe. He's threatening to open the immigration channel, and Turkey is the transit point for the Middle Eastern refugees to this purple area, which is the Schengen zone in Europe. And this has been going on the last few years, this massive mostly Sunni Muslim migration from the Middle East through Turkey into Europe. It is destabilizing Europe. That is a good thing for a lot of people. It's good for the Iranians, it's good for the Turks, it's good for the Russians. It's sort of a way of waging war without actually having military on the ground and expending valuable military asset. This is from back in November. President Erdogan angrily threatened on Friday to open the floodgates of migrants into Europe again, apparently in response to a move to suspend talks on Turkey's membership in the European Union. The Wall Street Journal just had a large article about the autocratic turn that's taking place in Turkey. The other sort of unknown aspect in this is this area that is populated by the Kurds, the largest ethnic group on the planet without its own homeland. And now the Kurds are divided into many different constituent groups as well. Some of those are essentially terrorist groups that attack and do bombings in Turkey on a regular basis. We see those in the news all the time. So Turkey wants to push down the Kurds. Iran wants to push down the Kurds. What's left of this thing that we used to call Syria and Iraq want to control the Kurds as well. They have an oil-rich area, so they have some economic muscle. And this is a further complication of things that are sort of playing into this. And so, for example, a recent deadly bombing in Istanbul was claimed by one of the Kurdish militant groups. You have the suicide bombings by Islamic State continuing. And you have this is a map from a year ago, November of 2015, showing sort of the division that existed at that time in the Middle East. And on the left, you can see some of the oil fields and pipelines and that type of things. And this is also a component of what's going on in Syria. It's not all that it's about, but pipelines across that region or are planned across that region are also important components in a very, very, what I would describe as just an incredibly complex geopolitical situation. But again, without judging the rightness or wrongness of all the different constituencies that are at war and conflict with each other, I'm looking more at it in the picture of the large geopolitical alliance that is prophesied in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And you see here, the purple area, which is Iraq, that's largely Shiite. You see the Islamic State in gray, that's Sunni Arab, Sunni Muslim. You see the Kurdish, which are a mix, some Arabs, some Christians, some secular. You see the red area, which is the Alawite in Syria. That is the Alawite is a sort of a subset or a related sect of Shia Islam. And then, of course, you had the green rebel areas, which was, you see that along the Golan. You see that somewhat around Damascus, and you also see that in the area around Aleppo. What Syria government and Russia have done, with the assistance of Iran, is to try to shrink that Sunni area down to where there is a Shia crescent, a purple and red crescent, all the way across from Iran all the way across to the Mediterranean. And that's part of what's going on in Aleppo. And in some respects, they've been very effective. The added benefit to causing all of this Muslim migration is that it is destabilizing countries in the northern part of the Mediterranean in Europe. And that gives Russia some freedom to do what it wants elsewhere as well. And the United States has contributed to this in great part. Some say the United States created funds and is the only thing that's keeping ISIS afloat. I don't agree with that. I agree that at a minimum, the United States, by going into Iraq, by breaking Iraq and then leaving, they created this enormous vacuum in the Sunni Muslim areas of Iraq that has now been filled by ISIS. Sunni groups have aligned together. They have formed alliances not only with Al-Qaeda, but also with ISIS. The fear of a lot of people who watch this is that as certain areas fall, such as Mosul, that what will fill the vacuum in Mosul from the defeat of ISIS will be Shia groups that will be even more brutal than the ISIS group that has been defeated. And I suspect that that will be true. These areas were where the Assyrians historically came from. They were some of the most brutal, vicious people in the history of the planet Earth. I don't think things have changed that much. So this map from a year ago, November of 2015, has changed extensively in the last year. So this is, again, I think, the prophetic alignment of Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Now, there are some consequences to Russia. They have actually joined together. They left, or after this Russian ambassador was assassinated, they have announced that they are going to have future talks on the future. They're going to have talks on the future of Syria in Astana, Kazakhstan. Now, Kazakhstan is this rather large country here. It's very, very large country. I mean, we're talking, I'm going to guess close to a couple thousand miles across. Here's the city of Astana. There will soon be talks. They've already had some preliminary meetings, is my understanding, of Turkey, Russia, and Iran about how they're going to divide up Syria and resolve Syria. Kazakhstan is also Muslim, and it is a rather bizarre city architecturally. It has some of these very, what I would call just sort of bizarre buildings. It's very, to say that it's eclectic in its architecture is an understatement. And here is a monument that is in Kazakhstan. But this is the last thing I think I'm going to talk about today. I can't see far enough in my slides. But with Russia's move into the Middle East, into Syria, where it has in many respects become the dominant power, Russia now has a Muslim problem with Sunni Muslims. Now, this is a long-standing issue with Russia. This is from Foreign Policy a year ago, Putin's Muslim Nightmare. It says here, the intro part says, the Russian president's intervention in Syria, and this is about 6 months after he intervened in Syria, is driven by fear of Islamic extremism among his country's own Muslim minority. But rather than squelching the threat, it's poised to make it worse. And this article goes into some detail, talking about he's taking a gamble by going into Syria. A closer look at Putin's gamble shows that his 7 may in fact end up as snake eyes, a losing gamble that fails for reasons uniquely Russian, relating to the often ignored but crucial fact that more than 20 million of Russia's 144 million people are Sunni Muslims, who naturally sympathize with the Sunni Muslims currently being bombed and killed by Russians in Syria. Now, this was a year ago, an article a year ago. Any Russian calculation in Syria could therefore severely undermine Putin's political power base at home. So at the same time, while he's sort of rising to power in the Middle East, he's also, by doing that, there's also a reaction among the Sunni Muslims that he has been driving out of Syria. Now, he wants them to get to Europe because he doesn't want them stopping in southern Russia, where he already has a Sunni Muslim problem. But listen to this, and it doesn't stop there. Not only has Putin ordered the bombing of Sunni rebels in Syria, he has also created a new Russian-led coalition of Shiite powers, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, capable of sharing intelligence and striking as one against its Sunni enemies. In this way, whether intended or not, he has opened a de facto war against Sunni Arabs who are led by Saudi Arabia and aligned with the United States. So it's essentially, in some respects, it's a proxy war between the United States and Russia. But again, the whole thing is very complex. For Putin, though, this poses an existential challenge from which there is no escape, a dilemma rooted in Russian demography and history. Most of Russia's Sunni Muslims live in the Northern Caucasus, historically the scene of anti-Russian Islamist upheavals. Clerics there deliver sermons considered sympathetic to the goals of the Islamic State, and as many as 2,400 young Muslims across Russia have answered the call, a development that sends chills up and down Putin's spine. The Russian president recently told CBS Charlie Rose that the most important reason Russia entered the war in Syria was the threat of their return to us. His chronic nightmare has been that, once trained in the tactics of modern terrorism, these young Muslims would slip back into Russia and blow up planes, trains, and theaters and schools as they have done before. We are, Putin explained, better off helping Assad fight them on Syrian territory. Fears about Islamist terrorism permeate Russian history. In the 19th century, Leo Tolstoy and other Russian writers penned popular stories about Russian officers fighting wild Islamist warriors in the Northern Caucasus. Now, Harold Road at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, that Dor Gold is president of, recently wrote an article. And I think it's important because this was written within the last 2 weeks, and it follows up on the same thought that Foreign Policy raised a year ago about Russia's Sunni Muslim problem. Listen to what some of this article says. The Syrian government, Russia and Iran, SRI, Syria, Russia, Iran, are trying to change the demographic makeup of Syria. They aim to depopulate Syria of the Arab Sunnis, which before the Arab Spring was the largest religio-ethnic group in Syria. They mostly inhabited a very fertile strip of land between Aleppo in the north down to Damascus and then southward to the Jordanian border. It was essentially the breadbasket of Syria. Those Arab Sunnis who did not leave are being forced to move to Idlib and Raqqa near the Turkish border. And so here you see this breakdown. The Arabs are in yellow. Those are Sunni Muslims. The Alawites are sort of the dark red that you see. Here's a little bit better picture. So this yellow area, these are all Sunni Muslims. And you can see this is the area of the Islamic State, which is Sunni Muslim. You see the Kurds up here in green. You see these are Armenians and others. Of course, you see Israel here, Jordan, and the area called Judea and Samaria, West Bank, are largely Sunni Muslim. This is the Alawite region here Lebanon. This is a map from a couple years ago from the Columbia University, Columbia Middle East 2000 project, I think it's called. I don't remember the exact name of it. But there's a whole series of maps that they have on ethnic and religious and other breakdowns of the Middle East. If you just type in Columbia 2000 maps, you'll get way more maps than you'll ever want to see. This is one of them. So this map, you see, it was created in 2006, updated in 2015. It needs to be updated now because of things have changed. Because this area of Sunni Muslims have effectively been forced out. They've gone here and they've migrated across Turkey into Europe and effectively destabilized Europe. So this is, but what I want you to take away from this map is this area of Syria and Lebanon is an incredibly complex mix of different ethnic and religious groups that all have very long memories about how they were wronged in the past. So the article of Harold Road continues. Examining Syria, Russia, Iran's military campaign and its policy towards the refugees they have created suggests this SRI strategy. The groups and places which the Russians have been attacking are the traditional strongholds of the Sunni Arab population, as of late Aleppo, the largest city in Syria. When the Arab Spring took hold in Syria, it was the Arab Sunnis, first and foremost, who revolted against the Alawite regime. They were aided in their efforts by fellow Sunnis in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other Sunni powers which provided arms and funding. From the perspective of the Alawites and other non-Sunni Arabs, the Sunni revolt constituted a clear and present danger to the non-Sunni regime. And Assad's going to try to protect his regime. That's what you would expect. The Iranians, Russians, and Syrian governments joined together to fight against the Sunni fundamentalists because all three see themselves in an existential battle against the radical Sunnis. They joined together to rectify this problem by ridding Syria of its Sunni Arabs and thereby change the demographic makeup of Syria forever. They are forcing the Arab Sunnis to leave the country through bombing, terror, and other methods. It is therefore not surprising that the overwhelming number of Syrian refugees are Arab Sunnis from the Damascus-Aleppo corridor, which has been the traditional heartland of the Arab Sunni community. Indeed, the majority of migrants currently living in refugee camps in Jordan and Turkey are largely Arab Sunni, as are the refugees who made it to Europe. Ditto Russia. The Russians, too, have an existential problem with the Sunnis, as about 98% of the former Soviet Muslims are Sunni. Today, Moscow's Muslim population is estimated at over 1/4 and higher, including legal residents and illegal workers, according to some analysts. Almost all, except most Moscow resident Azeris, are Sunni. Russia has a Muslim problem. Keep that in mind. Russia, too, feels an existential threat from these Sunnis like their Iranian and Syrian Alawite allies. Therefore, the Russian government has undertaken a program with some success to entice Russian Sunnis to convert to Shiism. After dislocating Syria's Arab Sunnis, the Russians, Iranians, and Syrian government moved on to phase 2, repopulating this now relatively empty Arab Sunni areas with Shiites, mostly from Iraq. As long as the present Shiite fundamentalist government remains in power in Iran, did I say Iraq? Yeah, from Iraq. Remains in power in Iran, what is happening in Syria is an existential threat to the Arab Sunni regimes, Israel, and others. Let me repeat that. As long as the present Shiite fundamentalist government remains in power in Iran, and I would suggest to you, as it increases in its scope of influence and power with Russia in Syria, in alliance with Turkey, because Turkey needs that alliance to protect its own government, Syria is an existential threat to the Arab Sunni regimes, Israel, and others. But if there is a change in regime in Iran, all bets are off. Under the Shah, Iran was a respected member of the international community. If a new leadership with similar concerns like those of pre-Islamic revolutionary Iran took over, the Shiite-Sunni eternal battle would most likely become less of an issue in inter-Muslim and international affairs. But we don't know that that's going to happen. Whatever the case, if the war in Syria continues and there are no signs to suggest to the contrary, we can expect that in the future, Syria will most likely look demographically completely different from what it did before the Arab Spring. So before the Arab Spring, Syria looked like this. It's changed. This whole area of Sunni Muslims is changed. And so I think it has, personally, I think this has incredible significance. Now, there is a recent article in the Wall Street Journal that says this: Russia's rise in Mideast creates enemies. Moscow has taken the place U.S. long occupied in the minds of many Middle Eastern and alien imperialist power, seen as waging war on Muslims and Islam. And so Russia is now getting pushback. This article talks about the fact that there haven't been recent anti-Muslim protests against the U.S. places. They're now being they're not anti-Muslim, there aren't any anti-U.S. protests. Now they're anti-Russian protests that are taking place in these areas. Well, here, it says this. That rise has turned Moscow into the region's indispensable power broker in Europe. Too, the migrant wave unleashed by the Syrian war strengthened Moscow's sway, fueling populist parties friendly to President Vladimir Putin. So, Syrian immigrants, Arab Muslim Syrian immigrants come in, populist parties rise, they're sympathetic to Putin. But it still creates the problem that Putin now has a more severe Muslim problem than he did before. So he's looking for alliances to do that, and he has to turn to Shia Islam and essentially in Iran. The assassination of Russia's ambassador to Turkey on Monday, however, highlighted the flip side of this dizzying rise. As America's influence has shrunk, Russia has taken the place the U.S. long occupied in the minds of many people in the Middle East, and alien imperialist powers seen as waging war on Muslims and Islam. There haven't been any recent anti-American protests in the region. Tens of thousands of protesters converged this month outside Russian missions from Istanbul to Beirut to Kuwait City, where the chanting led by local lawmakers was, "Russia is the enemy of Islam." The Turkish policeman who gunned down Ambassador Andrei Karlov on Monday shouted that he was avenging the suffering of Aleppo. The diplomat's assassination, while condemned by governments, was greeted with open joy on Arabic social media and in Palestinian refugee camps. Russia is certainly being perceived as the new bully in the neighborhood. The way people react to its involvement in the decimation of one of the most revered Sunni cities in the Middle East, Aleppo, is reminiscent of how the U.S. was viewed after its occupation of Iraq. You will only need to follow how the killer of the Russian ambassador was glorified throughout the region to get an idea of how Russia is despised by the populace today. Though Russia has become the immediate focus of this outrage, the fall of Aleppo is also intensifying support in the region for jihadist groups that plot terrorist attacks in the West, such as the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, Sunni terrorist groups. There is feeling that Aleppo signifies a new phase, said Lebanese lawmaker Bassem Shah. The level of anger is very high, and there is no doubt that what happened there will fuel a lot of extremism in Europe and other parts of the world. These days, however, Russia's involvement has grown. Anger at Russia is much more overt too, and it isn't just confined to jihadists. That, for one, poses a problem for Turkish President Erdogan's drive to forge an understanding with Mr. Putin and Iran over the future of Syria. But remember, Because of the purges in Turkey, Turkey is, I believe, relatively weak until they rebuild the leadership that they've purged. Whatever happens, this article continues. This is front page of the Wall Street Journal just last week. Whatever happens, regional leaders are well aware that Moscow has come to the Middle East to stay. They want to be reckoned with, to have enough clout so that nothing will take place in that region without their consent, the Secretary General of the Arab League said in an interview last week, and they are succeeding. So there will be an overspill from Syria. What I see happening is a strengthening of the alliance between what's left of the Syrian government, which is essentially Shia, an alliance with Shia Iran. That will increase the Shia influence in what remains of Iraq. And Turkey is also being involved, whether they like it or not. Now, let me just suggest this. For a long time, there's been a lot of speculation about what is the hook in the jaw that brings Russia down in to attack Israel in this Ezekiel 38 and 39 war. My personal belief has been for some time, and you can ask people, assuming they were paying attention, I was talking about this in the late 1990s because Russia has a Muslim problem. Russia had a Muslim problem at the time, and the breakup of the Soviet Union resulted in 5 what I call the Stan republics of the southern Soviet Union breaking off. They're oil rich, they're mineral rich, but they're mostly Muslim countries, some stronger than others. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, the Stan republics of Central Asia. I think those countries are also involved in this invasion of Israel in Ezekiel 38 and 39. It appears if Russia is the leading group that's bringing them in, or leading this coalition charge, I would suggest to you that the hook in the jaw might be Russia's desire to squelch the Sunni Arab, Sunni Muslim problem that it has within its own borders. There are reports that nearly 40% of the Russian military is Muslim at the present time. Russia has a massive problem. Russia is all about protecting Russian ethnicity and Russian Orthodox Church. Putin, I think, goes along with that. And my suggestion to you is that what could Putin do to squelch opposition, at least for a time, for his lifetime, of the Sunni Muslim opposition to him? And I would suggest to you that coming in to take care of the problem of the Jewish state of Israel might in fact be the hook in the jaw that draws them into this conflict. We see the alliances forming. Russia, Iran, Turkey. They're meeting in Astana. They're having meetings in this capital city of Kazakhstan to determine how they're going to split up Syria. I think we're seeing that alliance that's prophesied forming even more strongly than we thought. So that's all I have for this week. We'll talk about this, I'm sure, in the days and weeks and months to come. If you have questions, you can find my email at fbchapel.com, and feel free to email me. I'll try to respond as I can, or friend me on Facebook. By the way, if you want to friend me on Facebook, I've got way over 1,000 pending friend requests. I don't know if I'm going to have time to go back through all of those. It would be best if you send me a friend request to include a reason why you want me to be your friend on Facebook, like you listen to Prophecy Update that Fellowship Bible Chapel puts up, so that I know that you're not somebody who's just trying to spam me. So I would appreciate if you would do that. It makes it a lot easier for me to deal with these friend requests. Send me a message as to why you want me to accept your friend request. But pay attention. The things that are happening in the Middle East with Russia, Iran, Turkey, Israel, and what's going on in Europe is, I think, incredibly significant from a prophetic standpoint. God bless. We'll talk to you next week.